Go for it. Go for it. Yes, go for it. Go, 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 go. Perfect. Thank you. Timer. Thank you.
Good late morning. It's just before midday here in Tianjin. A warm welcome to all of you here in the room, here in Tianjin, but also to all of you who are watching us online. A warm welcome to this concluding panel of the annual meeting of the New Champions 2023 that took place in Tianjin and is about to conclude in Tianjin in China. I'm Mirek Dušek and I am with the World Economic Forum. This is a tradition that we have to have concluding panels, 30 minutes, so we will have a quick discussion together. And why we do them? Because we want to make sure that we are able to summarize or to look at the key highlights, the key learnings that we've had from those 3 days here of deliberations, dialogues, but also working sessions, workshops. We've had over 170 of them here over the course of 3 days. So it's that function of just looking back quickly and bringing those key highlights, but also looking forward, so making sure that maybe there are glimpses of next steps, things that have happened here that can be useful for people in the future. Now, the theme for this session specifically is entrepreneurship in a fast-changing economy. It is intimately linked to the overall theme of this meeting, and I like it because it has both. It has the realization that there is so much change around us, a lot of transformations, and we'll talk about some of them today. But then there is entrepreneurship, which to me signifies a sense of agency, either the creation of agency or reinstitution of agency, if you will. So those would be the two levels that we would like to cover here today. I am joined for this discussion by an august panel, and I'd like to introduce them now. A warm welcome to Ke Eugene, Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics and Political Science from the United Kingdom. A warm welcome. I'd like to also welcome Jason Bordoff, who is the co-dean of Columbia Climate School and founding director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at the Columbia University in the US. A warm welcome, Jason. Meirav Oren is with us as well. Warm welcome to you. Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Versatile in the United States. You're also in this cohort of global innovators. We have over 150 of them here, companies that are really at the cutting edge of things in different disciplines, and that have been at the core of the program here in Tianjin. And last but not least, Eswar Prasad, professor at Cornell University in the United States. So a warm welcome to all of you. I'd like to really follow a little bit these two axes of first kind of help us just map a little bit those sometimes dizzying transformations that are happening all around us and help us a little bit at least understand them. And then maybe what are the things that we could do going forward. So I would like to start with Ms. Ke Eugene, if I could. We are in China, in Asia. We've now been talking about it a lot, but it is a fact that in a low growth environment globally, 2.8% this year, about 70 or up to 70% of that could come from Asia Pacific. We see the reopening of China after COVID and other economies. And you are really one of the foremost authorities on the Chinese economy. So it would be good to understand from you kind of the key trends that you see. What are you excited about in terms of really opportunities in the Chinese economy, and what people should be possibly concerned about and pay attention to? Over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. China's going to hit and probably exceed the 5% GDP growth target this year, which will contribute to 35% of the world growth, which is significant, shows that China's a significant position in the economy. I think there are lots of things to be excited about because we can't lose sight of how many opportunities there still are, despite the short-term challenges in the economy. A few numbers. 600 million people still yet to reach middle income by international standards, with less than 2 2,000 RMB of monthly income, a 16 trillion RMB digital economy going forward, $38 trillion and more of renewable investment in the next 30 years or so. And I think China's opportunity is about ascending the global value chain, and that's where the efforts are going to be. But the short-term risk, China has a demand problem, unlike in the West. So the lack of demand comes from low confidence, which comes from, substantially lower income growth for households and reduced profitability of private firms. And I think that a significant boost to the short-term cyclical factors can actually lay down the path for a very good long-term future.
Thank you. If I could just follow up, we had the premier here, obviously he mentioned the figure 5%, and there was a sense that there was a clear realization that the restart, the momentum is necessary. So are there things that, in your view, we could expect on the policy front here that would be stimulating growth? What kinds of things can we expect, you think, here to do that?
I think there's room for more stimulus, although it's preference between preserving the financial stability and also somewhat constrained by resources that prevents a massive stimulus. But I think China's goal of reaching 23,000 per capita income by 2035 is a bottom line that they will try to achieve. If we look at the central government leverage is still low, so there's fiscal capacity on that front. I think it would be really very good to boost the confidence through consumption stimulation, and we'll see a series of stimulus policies in housing and also in, for instance, long-term durables. But I think there's more space to be done, yeah.
And can I ask you particularly about the real estate sector? Is this something that, you mentioned a stimulus potentially, is this something that people should be more excited about or more concerned about?
Cautiously optimistic.
Okay. Professor Prasad, if I could go to you, because you also are one of the leading authorities on the Chinese economy. Would there be things that you would mention on my first question, kind of overall the opportunities and risks here in China?
So the context is very important here, with China being a $19 trillion economy, as Professor Jin already alluded to. China's growth really makes a big difference to the world economy, but how it grows is going to be really crucial. And I think at this stage, while the economy does seem to be showing some signs of weakness, the real focus should be on what the drivers are of longer-term sustainable growth. So what this means is trying to promote what China has already been trying to accomplish, which is a shift away from heavy investment in manufacturing that is environmentally and economically not quite sustainable in terms of creating financial as well as environmental risks. But rather than undertaking a huge amount of macroeconomic stimulus right now, what I think is really crucial is to think about what is the underpinning of private sector confidence. Over the last few months, private consumption has not been doing well. Private investment last year did not grow as well. So the question is, what can the government do to signal a stable set of policies for the future that could very well promote short-term growth, but contribute to longer-term growth as well? And this is going to require not just stimulus policies, but moves towards a better financial system that does a better job of allocating resources to the most productive uses, some degree of fiscal restructuring that provides a stronger social safety net that encourages household consumption, and measures that move the economy towards a greener, more technologically intensive economy that I think can generate jobs, generate better productivity growth, which I think is the real key for China's long-term growth.
Thank you. You are based in the US, and obviously maybe not the elephant in the room, we've talked about it, but at the core of our proceedings have been also the cost of fragmentation, trying to really calibrate all the rhetoric around whatever you call it, de-risking, decoupling, or other words are being used. At the same time, we are seeing $700 billion in mutual trade last year, which was a record. So help us understand, because obviously, not only for the Chinese economy and not only for the US economy, but for the global economy, this trade and investment axis is crucial. And so help us understand how you view it. What is the calibration on the rhetoric? Are we going to see actual fragmentation or decoupling, or are we actually going to work it out and maybe it will be marginal to where we are now?
It's going to be crucial for these two countries, but also for the world economy, that the two largest economies in the world that have made the largest contributions to global growth in the last couple of decades get it together. But unfortunately, it does look like we are beginning to see some degree of decoupling, although the risks are obvious. Even US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has talked about the negative consequences to both economies if there were to be a significant decoupling. Now, whatever the reality on the ground, this uncertainty, the volatility that is caused by these rising tensions certainly affects businesses in both countries, and I think that is not helping very much at a time when confidence is low, and as Professor Jin mentioned, domestic demand has been very weak as well. Now, unfortunately, what used to be seen as a positive-sum game, the economic, financial, and trading relationship between the two countries has somehow morphed into a zero-sum or negative-sum game, and I think we need to get beyond that perception. The question is whether the political dynamics in both countries will let us do this. In the US in particular, with the November 24 elections approaching, I think it's going to be rough sledding to get us to a point where we de-escalate tensions. However, it is encouraging that Secretary Blinken was just here. Secretary Yellen might be here next month. So the fact that the two sides seem to want to continue to engage at the highest policy levels, but also at the technical levels, means that at least we won't get a further escalation of tensions, which might lead to much more fragmentation. But for the moment, I think we are in a very dangerous spot.
When I speak to business leaders, they're always confused to a certain degree, or interested and curious about kind of what is national security and what is not national security, what are the sectors that will be affected, and what are the sectors where quote-unquote normal commerce can continue. Any guidance there?
So if you think about recent pieces of legislative action in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, we do have national security policy being seen as a cover for what seem quite explicitly like industrial policy actions and or trade policy actions. So that is a negative, but I think the one hopeful sign here is that both countries, the two leading economies in the world, seem to be putting their faith in the new industries, the transition to greener modes of production, to clean energy. So what I think we need to find is a way to cooperate in these industries rather than think about this as an existential conflict between the two countries. And we've seen tremendous promise in the emerging market economies led by China about how digitization and various other technologies can really bring people up to a standard of living that might have seemed unimaginable just a few years ago. The US, of course, is a much more advanced economy, but it has its own problems. A lot of the population left out of the financial system that doesn't feel it has a sense of agency, a sense of inclusion. So I think there are many new technologies that portend a much brighter future, and shared expertise, sharing these technologies, I think might be a much better way for the two countries to move forward, and I hope we will get there.
Thank you. Moving to you, Jason, I mentioned at the beginning we will be mapping all those high-velocity transformations that are all around us. Energy transition or transformation, whatever we call it, is now, of course, a key question for the global economy. It's a key question for global climate, and there is a lot of developments. We just published here a piece of work that we do on a continuous basis around the energy transition. We call it the Energy Transition Index. We look at kind of a triangle of sustainability, security, and then inclusivity in terms of the energy systems. And one of the things that came out, for example, was that now we're seeing issues on the equity, on the inclusion side. So there is now people that have gained recently access to electricity. Now they may be in a situation where they can't afford to pay for that electricity. So again, maybe being priced out of the system. But overall, you are the foremost expert on also, by the way, the linkages between the energy system and the nature and climate agenda. Could you give us just where we are? How do you think, are we off track, on track on the energy transition, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, of course it's more complicated, but we're at an extraordinary moment. We're in many ways exceeding some of the wildest hopes and expectations we had if you came to a World Economic Forum meeting a decade ago and said that clean energy costs would decline at the speed and scale they have. Historic policy initiatives like the Inflation Reduction Act, record amounts of capital going into clean energy, more than in fossil fuels now. The ratio this year will be 1 to 1.7, nearly twice as much going to clean energy as fossil fuels. So enormous progress, and emissions are still going up. Oil use and gas use and even coal use are still going up. And I think that's just a reminder of the speed and scale of this challenge, how big the numbers are, how long energy transitions historically take, because the built infrastructure, the buildings, the vehicles, your heating systems, how long they take to turn over. It's also what happens when energy demand is growing, and that's not a bad thing. That means lower income parts of the world that are not responsible for most of the historic emissions are industrializing, becoming more populous, becoming more prosperous. But that is a big challenge. We just need all of this to move so much faster, right? We need, last year there was $150 billion spent on clean energy in emerging and developing economies. That needs to be $1 trillion by the end of the decade to be on track for our climate goals like net zero by 2050. Where's that capital going to come from? With huge currency exchange risks, political risk, higher cost of capital, all the rest. And in a time when we need to be working much more closely together, and we're seeing through things like the Inflation Reduction Act or many others, these growing geopolitical tensions and trends toward fragmentation that make it harder to cooperate. So we need a lot more, a lot faster, and entrepreneurship is a huge piece of that. We need the technology to scale. Roughly half of the cumulative emission reductions between now and 2050 will come from technologies not yet available at commercial scale. So we need innovation in technology, we need innovation in policy, we need innovation in finance, and we need innovation in education and how we're going to train future generations of leaders. That's a lot of what we're doing at Columbia.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up. You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. Also, you mentioned it, so this industrial policy momentum that we're seeing now around the world. I'm just curious, how do you see it in terms of the contribution of those acts and other similar measures to our effort overall in the world to get to net zero? Are there only opportunities, or are there also risks with that?
Yeah, I think the Inflation Reduction Act really is a historic piece of legislation. It's not just the largest thing the U.S. has done, it's one of the largest things any country has done to put huge amounts of capital into scaling clean energy much faster than would happen otherwise. It takes a pretty broad view of technology. It's not just solar, it's not just electric vehicles. There's significant resources in there for all the tools we're going to need, like carbon capture and carbon removal, advanced nuclear, hydrogen, energy efficiency, equity and justice in the transition. Policy matters more than ever before. That's an opportunity, but also a risk if you're an entrepreneur and you're building companies. Government is inserting itself more into the energy sector than it has in a long time. And then you could see the political pendulum swing. And of course, as we talked about already, the Inflation Reduction Act is a piece of industrial strategy. It is driven by a motivation to build domestic economic activity in the US, and also motivated by, as we talked about, national security concerns, that excessive dependence on any particular regions or country in the world, and particularly given the tensions between the US and China, heavily depending on China in particular for solar panels, for critical minerals refining and processing, is a source of energy security and geopolitical risk. And we need to make sure that we are de-risking, but not decoupling. And if you look at China, on average, if you look historically, it tends not to buy, say, more than 20% of its crude oil from any one source. It sees the benefits of diversification. So trying to figure out how we remain integrated as a global economy, because we need more and not less trade in clean energy, but that we do identify what some risks might be. Winston Churchill famously said when he shifted the British Navy from coal to oil, security in oil lies in variety and variety alone. So we've always known diversification is important for security. We need to take steps like that to build resilience, but make sure that we continue to work together, because we need more, not less, global cooperation to get where we need to be.
Thank you. Moving to you, Meirav, another big focus here when we talk about transformation was on specifically on AI. But of course, there is a larger batch of technologies that we would look at as fourth industrial revolution technologies that we need to pay a lot of attention to because they are really being developed at exponential scale and are impacting industries and societies at an unprecedented scale and speed. Now, in your company, you have been deploying AI for a while. You're actually an AI-based company. Now, with generative AI, the world has kind of woken up to the whole discipline of AI, but we also talk about how do we make sure that this is human-centric and we actually understand the impact and the interface of technologies like AI with industry or with society, if you will, a practical view of AI. And so since you've been at it for a while and you are deploying it in a, if you will, a traditional industry, I would be curious to hear from you on that.
Yeah, sure. And I think I represent kind of like both the industrial element of it being in construction as well as deploying AI in construction for a while. And just linking to Jason, construction is such a big part of what's possibly slowing us down in terms of energy consumption. So it'll be interesting to see what technologies like ours and many others can do. But in practicality, AI is about empowering people. And what Versatile does extremely well is get data out of job sites using a fairly simple IoT device that's actually on the hook of the crane. And that's extremely structured and repeated and non-human generated data allows us to understand what's actually happening on a job site, measure what is seemingly unmeasurable, and control what I would like to call, speaking of fragmentation, the most fragmented and non-structured manufacturing process on Earth. Take that and use those sensors data to analyze and understand the story of the job site. That's practical AI. And what we actually do with it is put that power back in the hands of the people who build. So at the end of the day, I see my business less of a AI or any other buzzword, if you'd like. And I love buzzwords. They work well in different elements. But it's that practicality of true empowerment of actual people in the field that need that data and the interpretation of the data to become practical insights that they can actually operate on. Understanding how long things take seems very simple, but most construction job sites today and most general contractors don't actually know how long installing a seal beam actually takes. We do, and I call that take the very high-level discussion about AI into deep practicality in the hands of the workers as insightful and actionable insights, really.
No, thank you so much.
Sure.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to also then shift gears a little bit to then kind of what would be things that you could take as next steps or things that you think are important that you would like to inform decision makers about that they should do and out of this meeting. Now, you are originally from Israel, and at the core of this meeting is entrepreneurship. Of course, Israel is known as a startup nation and really for having built a very successful ecosystem for entrepreneurship. But I just wonder, now we have, and you've had now for a while, of course, everyone trying to emulate Israel or the Bay Area and trying to figure out how to do this. But then you have all these other things happening in the world. Yes. So what would be, as an entrepreneur and someone who knows also the Israel ecosystem well, what would be the things you would advise governments or ask of governments in terms of the policy measures that could be really helpful? Because we talk about here, we need to unlock a new generation of entrepreneurship. Yes. Well, what should the policymakers do to do that?
Such a great question, and it is about entrepreneurial spirit and how do you spark innovation. And there's so many challenges that entrepreneurs are facing today. And I think a big part of it is what's happening with access to capital, and that's where policymakers really come in. And if I link it to Israel, for example, one of the things they have done extremely well is actually creating a grant structure that allows you to fail. And there's so much to be said about allowing entrepreneurs to fail without the risk of losing everything that you have, right? Mm-hmm. So those grants really allow companies to spark. And I'll say in this economic environment, as talent actually gets released into the market, it's our interest that they will actually start companies. And with access to capital being limited, creating the right structure of incentives and grants is literally key. And I think there's a lot to learn from Startup Nation. I will also say, though, those grants have to be structured in a way that allows venture capital to come in later on. So they can't put too many constraints that I do sometimes see from governments on those entrepreneurs and on those companies. They have to be allowed to grow into different geographies, for example. And that done right is probably key to solving a lot of the challenges that young entrepreneurs will see nowadays.
Thank you. If I could then keep all of you to 1 minute for this round. And it's a nice link on this entrepreneurship note still made up to back to you, Jason, because you have been looking a lot of the role of entrepreneurship in this whole process of energy transition and also in climate and nature. You have established a school around it also at Columbia. So how do you look at it at this interface?
Yeah, I mentioned before we need innovation in technology and policy and finance mechanisms. But what I've spent my last decade of my career on is innovation in higher education and innovation in policy research. So at Columbia University, we created the first energy policy research institute in the country, bringing practitioners together with academics to solve policy problems and help policymakers. And Columbia University has created the first climate school in the country. Not just a center, not just an institute, but on the scale of a school. So now we have Columbia Medical School, Law School, Business School, and the Columbia Climate School, the first of its kind. I could say much more about it, but the basic idea was this is such an interdisciplinary problem. If you want solutions to, say, get energy storage to scale, we need engineers figuring out how to improve battery chemistry, law professors figuring out how we're going to improve the permitting process so we can build at the scale that we need to, international affairs specialists thinking about the geopolitical tensions that might emerge if, again, most of the refining and processing is done in countries, say, here in China. We need all of them to work together in collaborative teams to solve problems. That's not something academia has particularly been good at in the past. And so that's what we're working on, as well as, of course, training the next generation of leaders. We need a lot more people coming into the energy space and the policy space and the finance space who understand climate and our sustainability challenges.
Thank you. Ms. Keujin, if I could move to you for your kind of final reflections. So we talked about the Chinese economy. Now it is the second largest economy in the world. We have all these shared challenges, climate change, mounting public or sovereign debt, all kinds of fragilities. We saw the premier visiting in Europe, being part of the climate finance summit there. So what could we expect? Because it's such a key role that China is playing in the global economy. So what would you expect, or what could we expect in terms of further developments on some of those shared challenges, particularly climate?
Globalization has had its challenges, at least 4 cycles of protectionism in history, where globalization ultimately prevailed. And I think coming from the UK, the Brexit, scarring effects of Brexit and the lingering effects, worse than the worst case scenario that economists predicted, is a sobering reminder how much the global platform still matters. And it's not just about trade and technology, but it's also about finance and financial integration. So eventually, as the global debt explodes, as we're going to potentially see another wave of global financial crisis, I just do not see how the world can come out of it peacefully peacefully without the two leading economies, central banks and governments working together to being the global anchor and providing for financial stability, and of course on climate as well. And lastly, the trillions of dollars at stake from economic disengagement. How much can we do with trillions of dollars? A lot. Eradicate malaria for one and end world hunger for another. So let's keep the spirit going.
Fully agree. Thank you. And you will close us off, Mr. Prasad. Speaking of financial systems and financial flow, so obviously this is the engine of our life together, our world economy, and has been, you've been writing a lot about the future of money and financial flows and the financial architecture that we can expect. And so I would just be curious because of course, now these days, particularly in the spring, people tend to look at the fragilities and all that. But how do you see it? Because there is a lot of also optimists who would say, well, this is the next era of financial inclusion. This is the next era of cross-border financial flows. So are you more optimistic, or are we also getting ourselves into more risks with the kind of the more digital financial architecture that we're going to see soon emerging or seeing emerging?
That very nicely epitomizes the spirit I've sensed at this conference, hope and anxiety. But I want to end on a positive note, so I'll start with the anxiety. Anxiety about geopolitical, geoeconomic fragmentation, about low growth in many economies. But the hope comes from the new technologies, which I think can lead us on a much better path. These are new technologies we've talked about in the context of finance more broadly. And entrepreneurs, I think, are really going to be crucial to link to the theme of this session, because they need to shape these technologies in ways that benefit all of us and ultimately make sure that they lead us to a better place. And financial flows, likewise, I think are going to benefit from many of these technologies that are reducing frictions in international payments. So long as we marshal our resources properly, have the right guidelines in place, I'm hopeful that technology can lead us to a much better future.
Thank you so much. I like it. More hope, less anxiety. That's a good prescription for life overall. Thank you so much. Thank you really for spending the time and helping us get a glimpse of some of the key outcomes, insights, and what's next for all of us. I'd like you to stay seated, please, because we will be followed closely by then the closing of this summit with the president of the World Economic Forum and the mayors of Dalian and Tianjin, and then we'll also have a artistic performance here as well that will close us off. So thank you so much. Please stay seated. We will continue momentarily.